I don't know about you, but to me at least, it feels like the PlayStation brand has completely changed again. So let me explain. Recently, I watched the June 2025 State of Play and something immediately felt different. Not just with the lineup, but the tone, the delivery, the energy. Gone was the usual procession of over-scripted marketing fluff wrapped around colourful shooters and live service corpses. This State of Play offered a change of pace, offering a showcase that felt more like a Nintendo Direct, a vibrant, confident celebration of game design that actually seemed to like video games rather than striving for Western realism. The presenters, almost entirely Japanese. The titles, joyfully and brazenly, mostly from that same country. In fact, Japanese developed content made up over half of the entire show, up from the 21% the previous year. That's a 30-point swing in just 12 months, and in my opinion, you don't make that kind of pivot unless you mean it. For keen observers, this appears to be a complete rebalancing of cultural authority, a return to the Japanese design DNA that once made PlayStation the gold standard of console gaming, offering up a shift that doesn't feel just symbolic but strategic, as if PlayStation has finally grown tired of being run like a Silicon Valley tech firm, chasing Netflix engagement metrics while losing its identity. It is instead returning to its more creative roots. So, the question is, has PlayStation truly abandoned its Californian experiment and simply remembered its roots, or is there something deeper at play here? Let's find out. I am Lady Decade, and if you like your gaming content hot, spicy and armed with receipts, then hit subscribe, because today we're talking about whether Sony's proudest gaming brand has rediscovered its roots or whether it's just cleaning up after its most expensive failure ever. Thus far, 2025 has been an extremely interesting year for gaming, with us all feeling the winds of change blowing across the entire industry. And if you need more proof that the winds have changed, just look at some of the most hyped games of this year. Let's start with Expedition 33. Developed in France by Sandful Interactive, this isn't your typical Western blockbuster. It's stylish, turn-based, narratively ambitious, practically soaked in the sort of creative philosophy we used to associate with Japan during the PS2 era. A few years ago, during the PlayStation's live service or bust phase, something like this would have been quietly buried under multiplayer metrics and monetization projections. In today's gaming landscape, players are treating it like a flagship title. Then there's Stellar Blade, the hyper-stylized Korean action game with anime flair and an unapologetically sexy lead. Under the California-led censorship regime, games like this were systematically targeted, blurred, cropped or shadow dropped into irrelevance, while Western titles were left untouched. But this time, no edits, no compromises, just bold, uncompromising art front and centre. This isn't just a new marketing direction, it's an editorial revolution. For the first time in years, PlayStation seems to be backing style, identity and game design over the safe, focus-tested sludge that nearly sank them. And if you're on board with that creative shift, then I've got something for you, because right now you can grab Expedition 33 for 43% off, or pick up the PC release of Stellar Blade for 26% off using the links in the pinned comments or the description. And if those don't quite tickle your pickle, then there's up to 90% off of thousands of AAA, modern, indie and retro titles too. Not only will these deals save you a crap ton of money, but you will also be supporting my work simultaneously. So, happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. So, gaming certainly feels like it's been changing recently, and to see circumstantial evidence of this, just compare the June 2025 State of Play to the disaster that was May 2024. Last year, Sony kicked off things with Concord, a $400 million live service turkey so undercooked, it made Anthem look gourmet. The game barely survived 11 days post-launch before it was pulled, refunded, and buried in a shallow digital grave. Firewalk Studios was shuttered, and its closure marked the single most expensive failure in the history of not just video games, but entertainment overall. That hot mess, by contrast, made Waterworld look well executed, which just goes to show how poorly managed that project was. Still, not everything was awful from PlayStation last year. The show closed with Astro Bot, the Japanese-developed platformer that didn't just win hearts, but it swept the Game Awards, BAFTAs and DICE Awards, becoming the first Triple Crown winner in over a decade. Commercially, over 2 million units sold in its first month. A bright, joyful celebration of mechanics, personality, and creative clarity. Yet instead, they chose to throw the majority of their marketing might into convincing us that Concord was worth our time. Fortunately, though, the cream would rise and Astro Bot's greatness would shine through. Unlike last year, this year's State of Play offered an entire showcase stacked with Japanese-developed content. Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster, Metal Gear Solid Delta, Neo 3, Silent Hill F, Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth 2, and Pragmata finally re-revealed with its original Japanese development team restored. None of these were footnotes, they were the main event. And the developers? Team Asobi, Square Enix, Konami, Capcom, Team Ninja, not just California studios pretending to be creative, but actual creative studios. Most presenters spoke in Japanese. The tone wasn't awkward, corporate, or focus grouped. It was confident, authentic, and above all, fun. The presentation between each year felt like night and day, and what we saw wasn't just a content shuffle, it was, in my opinion, a calculated effort to reassert the identity of the PlayStation brand. Not as a catch-all content platform, not as Netflix with joysticks, but as a haven for world-class Japanese-rooted game design. And if you're looking for the moment the tide truly turned us in this direction, look no further than the tale of two games, Concord and Astro Bot. One studio became the poster child for Sony's ambitious delusions on the West Coast. The other became proof that Japan still knows how to make magic. So, bearing this in mind, Astro Bot wasn't just a rebound, it was a cultural victory. Astro Bot features no guns, no loot boxes, no Hollywood cameo DLC, just genuine, unapologetic game design excellence, and people ate it up in 2024. And then came that moment, Nicolas Doucet's acceptance speech at the Game Awards. No corporate pandering, no performative virtue signalling, but just a load of sincerity. He even thanked the competition, Nintendo, crediting Super Mario Bros. As the game that changed his life and inspired everything he'd gone on to create. A PlayStation director standing on gaming's biggest stage, openly stating that it wasn't some analytics department in California that gave him purpose, it was Japanese creativity that compelled him to develop the greatest game released last year. The message was clear: quality works. Whimsy works. Japanese game design still works, and after a decade of chasing trends, players are proving they never stopped wanting it. To many, this should have been obvious from the start, so why on earth did PlayStation lose the plot? At what point did they convince themselves that people were clamouring for third-person misery sims, overpriced live service slogs, and games designed by committee in a Californian focus group? It's actually insane. But to understand how we got here, how the platform that once sold Senran Kagura with a straight face ended up launching Concord with a cringe reel, we need to rewind back to 2016, the beginning of what many now call the Californication era of PlayStation. Or what I'd like to call one of the most infuriating moments in gaming history. In April of that year, Sony Interactive Entertainment officially relocated its global headquarters from Tokyo to San Mateo, California, consolidating executive power in the West for the first time in the brand's history. And let's be clear, this wasn't some dull org chart reshuffle, it was a cultural coup. Sony justified the move by pointing to Japan's shrinking slice of the console market, and they weren't wrong. By 2016, just 1 in every 18 PlayStation 4s were being sold in Japan. But that was the symptom, the diagnosis. Sony wanted PlayStation to become a prestige global brand, less Akihabara and more Apple Park, so from here things would quickly begin to take a rather miserable turn. Enter Jim Ryan, a 30-year company veteran whose rise through the ranks coincided with this shift. Known for his no-nonsense pragmatism, Ryan made no secret of his views. Nobody really plays old games, he infamously declared, dismissing backwards compatibility as a nice to have. From here, franchises like Wipeout and Ape Escape were treated as relics, not legacies, and things continued to devolve under his leadership. Under Ryan's expanding influence, the company pushed towards blockbuster cinematic experiences aimed squarely at Western audiences, not just in content but in policy. Starting in 2018, all game submission documents, even for Japanese exclusive titles, had to be submitted in English. Japanese developers, many of whom had never dealt directly with Sony's Western offices, were suddenly forced to localize before localization was even relevant, and several developers reportedly complained that they were getting caught in policy limbo, waiting months for vague compliance feedback from California. And then came the content policing. Titles featuring anime art style, female protagonists in revealing outfits, or culturally specific humour suddenly began receiving disproportionate scrutiny. Sony's global content team, now based in the US, began enforcing a vague standard of appropriateness, a standard that somehow never seemed to apply to Western titles full of gore or violence, primarily focusing on gender-based or cultural optics. Senran Kagura, Omega Labyrinth, Nora Tsuujo, even Devil May Cry 5 all faced visual edits, censored scenes or cover-up patches. But meanwhile, The Last of Us Part 2 and Cyberpunk 2077 sailed through untouched. It wasn't just policy, it was philosophy. Japan, the birthplace of the brand, was now seen as an eccentric uncle to be quietly phased out. A tonal mismatch for PlayStation's new image that they seemed to desperately want to curate. In fact, between 2016 and 2019, the signs of this direction were subtle yet unmistakable. Quirky AA tier Japanese games stopped receiving marketing support. Showcase appearances dropped, the signature weirdness of PlayStation's early years all scrubbed clean in favour of photorealism and prestige cinema. Yeah, PlayStation has always been an international brand. Mark Kearney, Shuhei Yoshida and Andrew House, these are the global minds who built the brand previously, but until 2016, the cultural heartbeat of PlayStation was unmistakably Japanese. But now, under California's leadership, that heartbeat had flatlined. Then came Phase 2. In 2019, Jim Ryan was promoted to CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment, and the transformation accelerated significantly. The goal? Consolidate power, reduce risk, build a streaming-ready gaming brand that could compete with Netflix, Disney Plus and Game Pass, not just in playability but in platform philosophy as well. Games were rebranded as interactive experiences, live service models were greenlit en masse, and legacy franchises that didn't fit the new mould were quietly shelved. In this new era, one of the most shocking decisions came in 2021, the dismantling of Japan Studio. This was the team behind Ape Escape, Gravity Rush, Patapon, and Shadow of the Colossus, the spiritual architects of PlayStation's experimental soul. Their closure was spun as a business decision. Sony claimed the AA Japanese market was no longer viable, but internally, many saw it as an ideological purge, a signal that this kind of creativity that had once defined PlayStation had become a liability in the eyes of its Western leadership. And again, when people say leadership changes are normal, remember this. This wasn't normal. This was a deliberate cultural realignment backed by global policy changes, restructuring decisions, and a decade-long editorial shift that redefined what kind of games were allowed to succeed under the new Californian PlayStation banner. It was no longer just about making games people would buy, it was about remaking the brand into something executives thought investors wanted. And they almost pulled it off, until, well, they didn't. As the years passed, the cultural friction grew and the business model began to rot. Sony invested heavily in live service initiatives, acquiring West Coast studios such as Bungie and Firewalk, and simultaneously greenlit over 10 live service projects. Internal strategy decks emphasized recurring revenue, player retention, and digital storefront metrics, while terms like gameplay innovation and developer autonomy quietly vanished from the conversation. Creative authority flowed outward from California. Japan, once the heart of PlayStation, was downgraded to a support branch. mostly tasked with hardware development and localization. By 2024, the results were impossible to ignore. The American experiment wasn't just failing, it was actively consuming the brand from the inside out. The now iconic moment of collapse came in May 2024 with the release of Concord, Sony's $200 to $400 million live service gamble designed to be their answer to Overwatch and Destiny. 8 years of development, a marketing campaign that's pushed it as a flagship multiplayer shooter. And then, nothing. At launch, Concord reached a peak of just 697 concurrent players on Steam, not 697,000, just 697. Within 11 days, the game was delisted, full refunds were issued, and Firewalk Studios, which Sony had acquired just a year prior, was quietly shuttered. No tribute or fanfare, just a paragraph in a restructuring memo. But it wasn't just Firewalk. That same memo confirmed the closure of Pixel Opus and the dismantling of Visual Arts. In total, nearly 900 jobs were lost, and at least 14 live service projects were cancelled, put on hold, or deprioritised. It was one of the largest internal collapses in PlayStation history, a moment of reckoning that even longtime defenders of the Western strategy could no longer spin. And in the midst of all of this carnage stood a little robot from Japan. Astro Bot, developed by Team Asobi, didn't just serve as a contrast, it became the counter-narrative. A vibrant, polished, joyful single-player experience has stood for everything Sony had quietly devalued over the past decade. Aside from all of the awards and sales Astro Bot swept up, more importantly, the game's very existence helped rebuild some trust. Internal sources reported that Japanese developers, many of whom had grown frustrated or marginalised during Ryan's reign of terror, felt seen again. There was even a surge in third-party pitches from Japan in late 2024, a sign that the winds were finally shifting. And then came the good news that everyone had been waiting for, the final domino, Jim Ryan's resignation. Officially, he stepped down for personal reasons. However, according to multiple insiders, his departure was fast-tracked following mounting pressure from internal stakeholders, particularly in Japan and Asia, who felt systematically excluded from strategic decisions. The Concord backlash and the dismal May 2024 showcase, which featured zero meaningful Japanese content, reportedly sealed his fate. In response, Sony did something they had never done before. They split the role of CEO between two executives. Herman Hulst, the architect of PlayStation Studios' Western prestige titles, was given oversight of content and development. Meanwhile, Hideaki Nishino, a Tokyo-based executive with over 2 decades of experience in platform strategy, was appointed to oversee technology, hardware, and infrastructure. Some saw it as damage control, and others saw it as a recalibration. But either way, Japan finally had a seat at the table again, and not just as a legacy voice, but as a strategic equal. So this raises the question, is the PlayStation brand that we all know and love finally back? By mid-2025, it was clear that this was more than just a reshuffle. It was a reset, a tacit admission that the Ryan-era experiment had not only failed commercially, but harmed the brand's core identity. And then came the clean break. Hideaki Nishino, the quiet, technically minded veteran with deep ties to Sony's hardware ecosystem, was elevated to sole CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment. It was a decisive move. The Californian pipeline had run dry. Prestige cinema had become a parody, and the idea that PlayStation could be run like a Netflix offshoot had finally been abandoned. You see, Nishino wasn't installed to smile and nod, he came with a mandate: fix what the West broke. And the company hasn't just been pivoting, it has been returning to what we loved. Internally, he has helped initiate what one insider dubbed a full inversion of the Jim Ryan model, rolling out rigorous process reforms that prioritised studio autonomy, rebuilt trust with Japanese partners, and rebalanced content curation away from Californian executive bullshit. Decision-making was decentralised, oversight was sharpened, and creative authority began flowing back towards Tokyo. And clearly, the results have been immediate and visible. As stated at the beginning of this video, Japanese developed games made up over 52% of the 2025 State of Play showcase. Gone were the sterile cinematic reels and keynote-style monologues. In their place was something closer to a Nintendo Direct. Charming, energetic, unpretentious. Developers spoke in Japanese. Trailers didn't need overwrought narration or analytics jargon. The games spoke for themselves. PlayStation hasn't just been rediscovering its roots. It's replanting them. Now, critics will argue that this isn't necessarily because of an ideological shift, but rather an economic one, and that Sony didn't come home for any reason other than to pursue more money. And frankly, that proves the point, because if chasing revenue leads you back to Japanese creativity, it means that Japanese creativity is what sells. The market isn't rejecting style, charm, or cultural specificity. It's rejecting bland, westernized sludge, the exact thing PlayStation had to become, despite so many of the popular games in recent years still coming from Japan. Consider Elden Ring, for example. Developed by From Software in Tokyo, it's now sold over 30 million copies without battle passes, online-only DRM or Hollywood marketing campaigns. It didn't mimic Western design, it rewrote the rules. As one Sony executive quietly admitted, Elden Ring recalibrated our assumptions about what global audiences respond to. However, there are more reasons to pivot east beyond just the dreadful decision-making in California. In 2024, the Japanese games market reached $22.4 billion, narrowing the gap with North America and Europe. International exports surged, particularly for games that leaned into Japanese design values rather than trying to emulate Western ones. This wasn't nostalgia, it was demand. The pattern is global. Persona 6's mere teaser trended worldwide. Palworld, a surreal, unapologetically Japanese game, sold over 25 million copies across PC and Xbox. Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth 2 now trends regularly in Western fan circles, something unthinkable just a decade ago. As one senior PlayStation insider put it, "For years we treated Japanese content as a liability. Now we treat it like the ace in our hand." So, yes, maybe this is a financial course correction, but it's also a philosophical one, a realization that the identity Sony once tried to scrub out wasn't the weakness, it was the brand. Gamers didn't stop loving Japanese games, Sony just stopped listening. Now, finally, they're starting to hear us again. So, this isn't a revolution, it's simply a recalibration. Just to be crystal clear, PlayStation hasn't waged war on the West. They're not torching Naughty Dog or exiling Guerrilla Games. Those studios will continue to make games, but a belated and necessary course correction has taken place after years of Californian overreach. Sony is still investing in Western talent. Their games, Marathon and The Last of Us Part 3 are all still happening. Herman Hulst still has a seat at the table. The prestige-style narrative blockbuster isn't completely dead. However, fortunately, it is no longer the only item on the menu. What's changed is the balance of power. After nearly a decade of trying to homogenize everything into a Hollywood-flavored algorithmic product, Sony has remembered that its strength lies in cultural diversity, not uniformity. And that the Japanese half of its identity wasn't holding it back, it was the soul that kept it going. Under Nishino, PlayStation isn't becoming less global, it's becoming less arrogant, more willing to trust the instincts of creators regardless of which side of the Pacific they sit on. This is how mature platforms operate, by learning from failure, adapting to feedback and rediscovering what made them special in the first place. And if the June 2025 State of Play is anything to go by, PlayStation's future might just be rooted in its past, not as a nostalgia trip, but as a blueprint for sustainable success. Don't forget that right now you can grab Expedition 33 for 43% off, or pick up the PC release of Stellar Blade for 26% off using the links in the pinned comment or description. And if those don't quite tickle your pickle, there's up to 90% off of thousands of AAA, modern, indie and retro titles too. Not only will these deals save you a crap ton of money, but you'll also support my work simultaneously, or if you want to support what I do in a more personal professional kind of way. Access my behind the scenes cosplay library and more over on Patreon, and I'll see you all again soon.